Next, I want to talk about the college wage premium, the economics of going to college. Those who attend university receive a much higher wage relative to those who don't. Let's talk about the supply and demand of it. Between 1970 and 2000, more folks went to school. And when you have more people attending college and supplying their college skills to the marketplace, all by itself, you would believe that should lower the relative wages to non-college earners. However, we didn't see that in the data. Between 1980 and 2000, we saw the college wage premium double. College earners were doing about 1.5 times before, and now their wages are twice as big. So what's going on? At the same time of an increase in college grads, there was an even larger increase in the demand for the skills college imparts. Thus, the total effect ended up being positive. See, look at that. We're doing some pretty sophisticated stuff here. Both a positive supply shock and a positive demand shock. And because we have information from the data, we know that the positive demand shock was even larger. Hey, let's talk about the economics of immigration. Polls are indicating a higher popularity for more immigration. In the light green, we have those who want the present percent of an immigration population. In the gray are those who think it should be decreased. And in the dark green, those who believe we should have more. In the past 5 years, those who believe we should have more is now higher than those who believe we should have less, although just barely. If we ask economists down here in the bottom whether or not they agree with the statement, freer movement of people to live and work across borders within Europe has made the average Western European citizen better off since 1980. This, of course, is referencing to the creation of the European Union and how easy it is to get across country borders within the Union. The responses are nearly unanimous for agreeing or strongly agreeing, and there were 0 responses who disagreed. So let's do the supply and demand of this. Here we converted the vertical axis to wages, which is the price of labor, and to emphasize on the horizontal axis, this is quantity of labor. If you increase the supply of workers via immigration, again, all things held to itself, you would expect a lower wage for all. But that's not the only thing that we see happen. For example, we have seen immigrants into the United States for centuries. This particular graph goes back to 1860, and for the 50 years after the Civil War, the immigrant share of the population was 14%. In the early 1900s, there was a push against this. They created more restrictive immigration laws, and the share of immigrants in the population fell to just over 4% in 1970. In the 60s, during the Civil Rights Movement, through the 70s, and especially in the 1980s under Reagan, the government pushed for more immigration. And now we have seen closer to today, this graph goes up to 2010, approaching the levels of immigration that we saw in centuries past. So if we've been seeing immigration for centuries in the country, why haven't wages continued to decline for centuries? In fact, we've seen wages grow the whole time. If we're seeing higher wages, that means that immigrants also demand goods and services, and that in turn will increase the demand for labor. And so what we see that the increased demand effects are larger than the increased supply effects, thus in net, wages rise for all. How does immigration affect the wages of the native-born population? Both the supply effects and demand effects matter. But here's the thing, you don't just have to believe a graph that I drew in a little board here. We tested this hypothesis many times, and we did so very dramatically during the Great Depression. Unemployment peaked at 25%. So if you could think of a scenario where there was too much labor lying around relative to how much was demanded in the market, the Great Depression would qualify. And in fact, the excess labor story became very popular. Congressman Martin Dees said, the large alien population is the basic cause of unemployment. So when the economy goes bad, everyone looks around for the cause, and they want to fix it. And this idea to blame the Great Depression on the large population of Mexican immigrants caught on. And so society acted on it. They forcefully removed 400,000 first and second generation Mexican Americans. That's right, second generation, meaning they deported U.S. constitutional citizens. And this ended up being about 1/3 of the Mexican population in America. And it wasn't just the government. They had nonprofits cooperate, they had local communities cooperate, they had churches cooperate. It was a broad effort. This map over here shows the Mexican repatriation intensity between 1930 and 1940. This recently published paper looked at the labor market effects of Mexican repatriation, largely looking at census data between 1930 and 1940. And this will help us quantify which effect is going to be stronger, the labor supply effect or the labor demand effect. The previous thinking of the congressman is purely in labor supply, not taking into account any demand effects. But those repatriated workers will stop buying stuff. will stop building their own businesses. What if immigrant workers were complements rather than substitutes to native workers? Then removing them would also remove the demand to hire all workers, and this would lower native wages. Of course, it's not just enough to have theory or to hypothesize about something. What did the data say? In this top table, we can see the results of the statistical test. Looking at the change in employment of native workers between 1930 and 1940, we see a negative number. This means there were less jobs after the repatriation. The study also has enough data that we can split it between low-skilled and high-skilled workers. We find that the low-skilled workers in the Great Depression, in the 1930s, in the worst period of the United States economy, were worsened because of the push to deport. I should emphasize the particular experimental design of this paper isn't just correlational. They use a statistical technique which allows us to make a causal argument, and this is by using the distance to the nearest railroad going to Mexico as the causal mechanism. The conclusion of the paper reads as follows. Overall, not only did politicians' claims not materialize, but it seems like the repatriation program may have hurt some native workers. Specifically, the repatriation of Mexicans were mostly laborers and farm workers, reduced demand for other jobs in the local economy mainly held by natives. This was partly because of the complementarity between Mexican and natives, and the fact that specific local factors, such as entrepreneurship in Mexican-intensive sectors, shrunk as Mexicans left. The repatriation of Mexicans did not even result in other immigrants gaining jobs. This campaign caused pain, disruption, and suffering for Mexicans, but did not deliver any of the labor market benefits promised to the native workers. With 1.2 million observations, they find that a 1% increase in repatriation led to a 0.2 to a 0.3% decline in native employment and wages. We also find that immigrants are very important to the United States' success in innovation, in technological improvement. For example, going back 500 years, of the 55 grants of monopolies made by Queen Elizabeth I, 21 were issued to aliens or naturalized subjects. 50% of economics professors receive their bachelor's degrees from international universities. America is able to bring the best of the best from across the world. And finally, the lion's share of inventors immigrate to the United States. So this graph is showing those immigrants who leave the country and those immigrants who come to a country. The dark green on the bottom represent those who leave, the light blue on top represent those who come, and that black dot represents the net position. So China and India on average between 2000 and 2010 saw more inventors leave the country than enter the country. Some countries are fairly near the middle, such as Germany, Australia, or Japan, but the United States on the far right of this graph is clearly an outlier. Far more inventors come into the country than leave it. Now that graph only goes up to 2010, there is a worry that this pattern might not continue into the future, and thus harming the United States' position as a global innovator and driver of economic growth. Oh, I hope that was a really interesting look into how supply and demand explain so much about how our world works, and how we can use it to help us improve it, describe the current situation, and prescribe real ways that can help us make the world a better, more prosperous place.